Picture this. It's 1721, somewhere in the warm, heavy waters off the coast of West Africa. A pirate captain named Bartholomew Roberts has just been hit twice, once in the throat, once in the chest, during a desperate firefight with a Royal Navy warship that has finally, after years of failed attempts by half a dozen governments, caught up to the most successful pirate of the entire era. His crew does exactly what he asked them to do weeks earlier, in calmer weather, in what some of them probably assumed was a joke. They wrap his body, weapons and all, and throw it into the sea. Not out of disrespect. Out of love, actually. And out of strategy. They didn't want the Navy parading his corpse through a London street or hanging it in chains as a warning to others. They wanted him to disappear, completely on his own terms. It's the kind of death that fits the legend perfectly. Wild, lawless, completely out of control. Except it wasn't. Bartholomew Roberts' ship ran on a written legal document, 11 specific rules voted into existence by the entire crew that every single man aboard had to sign or mark if he couldn't write, before the anchor was ever raised. There was a rule about bedtime. There was a rule banning gambling. There was a rule guaranteeing a cash payout if you lost an eye or an arm in battle, something that looked remarkably like disability insurance, written up nearly 300 years before any government on Earth thought to create one. There was even a rule protecting the ship's musicians' day off, in a contract signed by men the entire world considered murderers and thieves. If that sounds invented, I understand completely. It sounds invented to almost everyone the first time they hear it. But here's the thing. Every rule I'm going to walk you through tonight is real, documented, recorded by the people who actually lived through it, in some cases in their own handwriting, preserved in court records from the men who were eventually caught and tried for it. And some of these rules are stranger, more specific, and frankly more thoughtful than anything a screenwriter would ever dare invent, because no one writing fiction would think to add a clause about musicians getting Sundays off into a contract among thieves. So tonight, get comfortable, settle in, because where we're going requires no effort from you at all except listening. We're going aboard a pirate ship somewhere in the early 1700s, and we're not leaving until you understand exactly how a floating crew of outlaws, completely outside the law of every nation on Earth, built one of the strangest, most oddly fair legal systems in the history of the sea. Some of what you're about to hear will sound like satire. It isn't. Some of it will sound like generosity from men who had no reason to be generous. It was. And by the end, you might find yourself wondering whether the pirates understood something about fairness that the rest of the 18th century had completely missed. Before we dive in, if you're the kind of person who likes falling asleep to long, detailed history, the kind built to slow your mind down rather than speed it up, go ahead and hit subscribe. And drop a like if this is your kind of thing. I always enjoy knowing where everyone listening tonight is tucking in from, so feel free to leave that in the comments before you drift off. Now, let's get into it. Chapter 1. The Floating Republic here is a question worth sitting with for a moment. What do you do when you take 200 armed, often traumatized, frequently half-starved men, and put them onto a wooden platform in the middle of an ocean, with no police, no courts, no government and no king who could ever reach them? What happens to people when every external authority that normally keeps a society in line simply disappears? You'd assume chaos. That's the natural assumption, and it's the assumption almost every pirate movie ever made is built on. Drunken brawls, constant betrayal. A captain who rules through pure terror because terror is the only currency available to him. It's a satisfying image. It's also almost completely wrong. What actually happened again and again on ship after ship, across roughly 80 years of what historians now call the Golden Age of Piracy, was the opposite of chaos. It was structure. Detailed, specific, voted on structure, written down in documents the crews called Articles of Agreement, agreed to before the ship ever left port, and enforced with a level of consistency that would have impressed a magistrate back in London. Let's set the stage properly, because the why of all this matters just as much as the what. The Golden Age of Piracy is usually dated from around the 1650s to the 1730s, but it had a real peak, a kind of golden decade within the Golden Age, running roughly from 1715 to 1725, and that timing isn't an accident. In 1713, a massive European conflict called the War of the Spanish Succession finally ended, and with it ended the jobs of tens of thousands of trained sailors. Navies that had needed every able body they could find suddenly didn't need them anymore. Privateers, men who had been legally allowed to attack enemy ships during wartime, essentially state-sanctioned pirates, lost their letters of permission overnight. Thousands of skilled, armed, unemployed seamen were dumped onto the docks of port towns with nothing to do and no money to do it with. Some of them drifted toward an island in the Bahamas called New Providence, and its main settlement, Nassau, a port so loosely governed at the time that it became. For a brief and remarkable stretch between roughly 1716 and 1718, something historians now half jokingly and half seriously call the Pirate Republic. There was no single king of Nassau. Instead, a rough council of captains, men whose names would later become infamous, settled disputes between crews, divided up territory for repairing ships, and generally ran the town the same way they ran their vessels, through negotiation, reputation, and the constant threat that any captain who got too greedy or too violent would simply find himself without a crew the next morning. Picture an entire town built on exactly the same logic as the ships themselves. No governor answering to a crown, no formal court. Just thousands of armed, dangerous men who had collectively decided that some shared rules were better than none at all. That's the world these Articles of Agreement came out of. Not a single genius lawgiver handing down rules from on high, but an entire culture of outlawed sailors scattered across a dozen different crews and a handful of half-lawless ports, independently arriving at strikingly similar conclusions about how to keep a dangerous, desperate group of men from destroying itself from the inside. Now think about what those men were walking away from, because that's really the key to understanding everything else in this story. Life on a legitimate sailing ship in the early 1700s, whether a merchant vessel or a Royal Navy warship, was brutal in ways that are hard to fully picture from where you're lying right now. Pay was often withheld for months, sometimes years, with no real way to demand it. Food was rationed to the point of malnutrition on long voyages, and scurvy, a disease we now know is caused by something as simple as a lack of vitamin C, killed sailors by the thousands because nobody in command particularly cared to fix it. Discipline came from the captain alone, and the captain answered to almost no one once the ship was at sea. A man could be flogged with a whip called the Cato 9 tails for offences as small as talking back, and there was no appeal, no vote, no second opinion. And then there was impressment, the practice of literally kidnapping men off the street or off other ships and forcing them into naval service, sometimes for years, with no choice in the matter at all. Consider what impressment actually looked like in practice, because the word itself can sound almost bureaucratic, almost gentle, when the reality was anything but. Press gangs, groups of armed men working on behalf of the Royal Navy, would patrol the docks and the taverns of English port towns, particularly whenever a new war loomed and the Navy needed bodies fast. They didn't ask politely. A man could be drinking quietly in a tavern, minding his own business, and find himself struck on the head, dragged through the street, and waking up hours later already at sea, his old life simply gone. With no goodbye to a wife or a mother, no chance to settle his affairs, nothing. Some men were taken directly off merchant ships they'd already signed on to, seized mid-voyage by a naval vessel that outranked their captain's authority entirely. The law allowed it. The law, in fact, actively depended on it, because the Royal Navy's ships needed thousands of trained sailors, and the voluntary recruitment system never came close to filling that need on its own. So when a man finally escaped that life, whether by genuinely choosing piracy, or finding himself aboard a captured ship and simply electing to join his captors rather than be marooned or worse, he wasn't walking into lawlessness for the first time. He'd lived under a kind of lawlessness already, just one with a king's seal stamped on top of it. One where the violence done to him was perfectly legal, and the violence he might someday do back was not. That distinction mattered enormously to these men, even if it means very little to us, lying comfortably wherever you are tonight. The rules they built afterward weren't really a rejection of order. They were a rejection of order that only ever protected the people at the top of it. Can you imagine being taken from your own life, against your will, and told you now belong to a ship? Having absolutely no say in who commands you, what you eat, or whether you live to see land again? That was the normal, legal, everyday experience of an enormous number of sailors in this period. So when these same men, desperate, furious, and suddenly armed with the knowledge that nobody was coming to save them or punish them either, turned to piracy, you'd expect them to abandon rules altogether, to finally do whatever they wanted, with nobody left to stop them. And this is where the story gets really interesting, because that's not remotely what happened. What pirate crews built instead was, in almost every documented case, more structured than the navies they'd escaped. Not less. The very first thing a new pirate crew typically did, often before they'd even chosen a target to attack, was sit down together and write out the rules they would live and die by. These were called Articles of Agreement, sometimes just the articles, and they functioned exactly like a legal contract, because that's exactly what they were intended to be. Here's what that actually looked like in practice. The crew, not just the captain, the entire crew, would draft a list of rules covering everything from how plunder would be divided, to what counted as a punishable offence, to what would happen if someone got hurt in a fight. Then, in a ritual that comes up again and again in surviving court records and pirate memoirs, every man aboard would step forward and sign it, or if he couldn't write, make his mark, usually an X next to his name. Some crews had men swear their oath on a Bible, the same way you'd swear in court. Other crews, interestingly, didn't trust that a Bible oath would mean much to men who had already broken nearly every other law and commandment they'd grown up with, so they swore instead on a hatchet, or on crossed pistols and a sword laid out on the deck. The logic was almost touching, in a strange way. If you don't believe these men respect God's authority anymore, find something they do respect, and make them swear on that instead. Doesn't that detail change how you picture this whole world? A crew of supposed godless criminals, carefully debating which object would make an oath actually binding, because keeping your word still mattered to them, even after they'd thrown out every other rule society had given them. It's worth picturing the actual scene a little more closely, because the historical record gives us enough detail to do that. This wasn't a hurried formality, scribbled out in 5 minutes before the ship left the dock. On many crews, drawing up the articles took real deliberation, arguments over wording, debates about exactly how plunder should be split, negotiations over what would count as a serious enough offence to warrant death versus merely a flogging or a docking of pay. Imagine standing in a crowded, smoky room or on a creaking deck at anchor, surrounded by men who individually might be considered among the most dangerous people in the Atlantic world, all of them arguing patiently over the precise wording of a clause about candle curfews or weapon maintenance, the way a modern committee might argue over a bylaw. There's something almost absurd about that image, and something genuinely moving about it too. These were men with nothing left to lose in the traditional sense, and they were still negotiating in good faith with each other, because good faith between crewmates was the only currency that still meant anything to them. Psychologists and sociologists who study extreme or isolated environments today, submarine crews, polar expedition teams, even survivors stranded together after a disaster, keep finding the same basic pattern these pirate crews stumbled onto 300 years earlier. Take away every external rule, every police officer, every government, and people don't simply revert to violence. Most of the time, they build a miniature government almost immediately, often within hours, because the alternative total unpredictability, with no way to know whether the man next to you will help you or turn on you, is somehow more frightening to the human mind than submitting to rules, even strict ones. We are, it turns out, a species that finds structure comforting even when we're the ones inventing it from nothing. Maybe, especially then, that's worth holding on to as we go deeper into this story tonight, because it reframes everything that follows. The captain, the quartermaster, the votes, the punishments. None of it was an aberration. It was an entirely predictable, almost universal human response to a specific kind of pressure. Strip away the parrot and the eye patch, and what you're left with is a remarkably familiar story about what people do when they're frightened, isolated, and have only each other left to depend on. Once the articles were signed, they weren't just suggestions. They were treated as the actual constitution of the ship, and I'm using that word deliberately, because it's the word a number of historians studying these documents have landed on too. There's a particular phrase that keeps showing up in serious academic work on piracy of this era. The idea of pirate ships as a kind of floating republic, not a democracy in the full modern sense. We'll get into exactly how power actually worked aboard these ships in the next chapter, and it's more interesting than you'd expect. But something startlingly close to a self-governing society, built from scratch by men the rest of the world had already given up on. There's one more piece of shared identity worth understanding before we move on, because it shows up in nearly every painting, every cartoon, every costume built around this era, usually without anyone quite knowing why it mattered as much as it did. The black flag, what later generations would nickname the Jolly Roger, typically featuring a skull, and depending on the specific crew, crossed bones, a full skeleton, an hourglass, or a raised cutlass, wasn't just decoration in the way we might casually use that word today. Raising it was a deliberate signal, sent to a targeted ship well before any cannon fired: surrender now, and you will likely be treated reasonably. Resist, and you won't be. Crews often flew a national flag, or no flag at all, right up until they were close enough to strike, then ran up their own black colours at the last possible moment, partly for tactical surprise, and partly as a kind of declaration of identity, a way of saying unmistakably exactly who they were and exactly what came next. Every man aboard, regardless of his actual role on the ship, served under that same shared symbol, the way a soldier serves under a regiment's colours. It wasn't legally a nation, it behaved, in small but real ways, like one anyway. Think about what that actually required. These weren't men with legal training. Most of them had limited formal education, if any. And yet, working from nothing but experience and necessity, they arrived again and again at remarkably similar solutions, written rules, agreed to in advance, applied consistently, with real consequences for breaking them. They built courts without judges. They built insurance without insurance companies. They built voting without a single one of them ever having voted for anything in their lives before. Why would men who had just rejected the entire legal structure of their home countries turn around and build a new, smaller legal structure of their own? It's a question worth sitting with, because the answer tells you something true about human beings in general, not just pirates specifically. When the external rules disappear, the need for rules doesn't disappear with them. If anything, it gets more urgent. Put any group of people into a small, dangerous, high-stakes situation with no outside authority to settle disputes, and watch how quickly they invent their own court system, their own customs, their own version of fairness. It happens in lifeboats. It happens in long-term wilderness expeditions. It happened 300 years ago on wooden ships full of armed criminals in the middle of the Atlantic. That's the foundation we're building on tonight. Everything else, the bedtime rule, the gambling ban, the insurance payouts, the musician's day off, only makes sense once you understand that pirate ships weren't an absence of order. They were a different order entirely, built under pressure, by people the rest of history dismissed as having no order at all. But here's the thing, knowing that the rules existed is only the beginning. The real surprises are in the specifics, in exactly who got to make these rules, and exactly how much power the captain actually had once they were written down. Because if you think the captain of a pirate ship was some kind of absolute tyrant, the next part of this story is going to rearrange a few things in your head. Chapter 2. The captain who could be fired. Close your eyes for a second and picture a pirate captain. Go on, actually do it. What do you see? I'd guess it's something like this. A man standing on the quarterdeck, coat flapping, sword drawn, bellowing orders at a terrified crew who jump to obey because disobedience means death on the spot. That's the image. It's in every film, every cartoon, every theme park ride built around this era. The captain as absolute monarch of his own small wooden kingdom, answerable to no one. Here's what most people don't realise. That image is almost the exact opposite of how authority actually worked on the vast majority of documented pirate ships. The captain of a pirate ship was elected. Voted in by the crew the same way you might vote for a representative, except the stakes were considerably higher than a school board election, because the man you chose would be making decisions that could get you killed within the week. And just as importantly, a pirate captain who was elected could also be deposed. Voted out. Stripped of command by the same crew that had raised him up, if enough of them decided he was cowardly in battle, cruel beyond what was useful, incompetent at navigation, or simply not delivering the plunder he'd promised. Think about how strange that is for a second. In 1720, if you were an ordinary sailor born in England, you had no vote in choosing the king who ruled your entire country. None. Kings were born into the job. But if that same man went on the account, that was the slang for turning pirate. Going on the account, he suddenly had a vote in choosing the captain who would command his own life and death on a daily basis. The most lawless men in the Atlantic world had more direct say over their leadership than the law-abiding subjects back home did over theirs. Why would a den of cutthroats bother voting at all? Why not just let the strongest, most violent man take charge and intimidate everyone else into line, the way the movies suggest? The honest answer is practical, not noble. A captain who ruled purely through fear, with no accountability, was a massive liability on a ship where every single man needed to trust that decisions were being made for the good of the crew, not the ego of one person. Pirate crews had seen, up close, exactly what unchecked authority looked like. They'd lived under it on naval and merchant ships, remember. And they understood something that took the rest of the world centuries to formalise into modern political theory. Power without accountability tends to get people killed. Now here's where it gets even more interesting, because the captain wasn't actually the most powerful person on a pirate ship most of the time. That title usually belonged to a separate position entirely, the quartermaster. The quartermaster was also elected, separately from the captain, and his job functioned almost like a built-in check on the captain's authority, something close to a separation of powers, 300 years before most people would have used that exact phrase. The quartermaster controlled the distribution of food and water. He oversaw the division of plunder, making sure every man got his fair share according to the articles, with no favouritism toward the captain's friends. He often acted as a kind of judge for disputes between crew members, settling arguments before they escalated into violence. And critically, on most ships the captain's word was treated as absolute law only during a chase or an actual battle. The moments when split-second decisions genuinely needed one voice in charge. The rest of the time, day-to-day life on board was effectively governed by the quartermaster, with the captain holding more of an emergency powers role than a constant dictatorship. One specific quartermaster duty deserves a closer look, because it tells you something about how seriously these men took the idea of structured conflict resolution. When two crew members had a serious dispute, something beyond a passing argument, something that threatened to turn violent, many articles explicitly forbade settling it with a fight aboard the ship itself. Instead, the quarrel was set aside until the ship reached land, where the two men would face off ashore in a formal duel, typically with pistols first and swords as the follow-up if neither shot landed. The quartermaster, or sometimes another designated officer, would oversee the whole affair, making sure the rules of the duel itself were followed fairly. It's a strange kind of order to find among supposed outlaws. Even violence, when it came to settling personal scores, had to be scheduled, witnessed, and conducted by agreed-upon rules, rather than erupting wherever and whenever tempers ran hot. A fight allowed to break out below decks, in cramped quarters, with weapons close at hand and adrenaline already running high, could spiral into something that endangered the entire crew. A fight postponed until landfall, conducted formally, with witnesses and an officiant, was just safer. Even their grudges were managed with a kind of bureaucratic patience that would surprise almost anyone walking in expecting pure chaos. Doesn't that completely rearrange the picture? A pirate ship wasn't one tyrant and a crew of victims. It was closer to two elected officials sharing power, with the rest of the crew holding the ultimate authority to fire either one of them. Bartholomew Roberts himself, the same captain whose death opened tonight's story, is a perfect example of how this actually played out. According to the records kept by his contemporaries, Roberts didn't seek out the captaincy of his ship. He was a relatively recent recruit, captured from a merchant vessel that the pirates had taken as a prize, and when the previous captain was killed shortly afterward, the crew turned to Roberts and elected him on the spot, reportedly because of how clearly and confidently he spoke during the crisis. He was, by several accounts, somewhat reluctant. He apparently said something to the effect that, having gotten a taste of being a commander, it was better than being a common man. Given the dirty work the role usually carried, but the point is that the choice wasn't his alone to make. It was a vote. The crew picked him, and the crew could, in theory, have picked someone else, or removed him later if he failed them. Step back from the ship itself for a moment and think about what this voting system actually represented in the wider context of the 1700s world. In Britain at this time, only a small fraction of men, those who owned a certain amount of property, had any right to vote in parliamentary elections at all. Women couldn't vote anywhere in Europe. Most ordinary working people, sailors very much included, had no formal political voice whatsoever in the governments that taxed them, conscripted them, and occasionally hanged them. And yet here, on ships sailing under a flag that meant instant death if caught, ordinary sailors, former labourers, former indentured servants, in some documented cases former slaves, were exercising more direct democratic control over their own immediate leadership than most of Europe's population would experience in their entire lives. That contrast wasn't lost on the governments of the era, either, even if they'd never have framed it in those terms. Part of why pirates were prosecuted with such theatrical, public severity, publicised trials, bodies left hanging in chains at harbour entrances as a warning to passing ships, wasn't only about punishing theft and murder, serious as those crimes were. It was about stamping out, as visibly and brutally as possible, the idea that ordinary sailors could simply walk away from an unjust system and build a fairer one of their own, with their own hands, using nothing but agreement and a willingness to enforce it. A government built on hierarchy and inherited authority had every reason to make piracy look as monstrous and as doomed as possible. Because the alternative story, that a band of supposedly lawless men had built something more participatory than the legal system back home, was not a story any king's court wanted ordinary sailors hearing too clearly. Have you ever been part of a group, a team, a project, even a friend group, where the person nominally in charge actually had less real influence day to day than someone with no official title at all, just because that person had earned trust through fairness and competence? That's almost exactly the dynamic that played out on these ships. Except the consequences of getting it wrong weren't an awkward meeting. They were mutiny, or marooning, or death. This system wasn't universal, and it wasn't perfect. There were absolutely pirate captains throughout this era who ruled more harshly, and crews that fell into real chaos despite having articles on paper. The structural Dina was a tendency, not an iron law. But the tendency itself is the story, because it shows up across so many separate, unrelated crews, with no central pirate government coordinating any of it, that historians studying these documents keep landing on the same conclusion. This wasn't one eccentric captain's idea. It was something pirates kept reinventing independently, again and again, because it worked. Consider the case of Charles Vane, one of the more notorious captains operating out of Nassau during the height of the Pirate Republic. In late 1718, Vane found his ship facing a French warship that, by most assessments, significantly outgunned and outmanned his own vessel. Vane made the call to flee rather than fight, a defensible decision by any rational military standard. Arguably the only decision that wouldn't have gotten most of his crew killed. Part of his own crew disagreed loudly, in front of everyone, and a vote was called. The crew sided against him. Vane was formally deposed as captain that same day, set adrift in a small sloop with a handful of loyal men, while the rest of the crew chose new leadership, eventually settling on the man who would go on to command Anne Bonny and Mary Read, John Calico Jack Rackham. Vane's reputation by most pirate standards was fearsome. None of that mattered once the crew decided he'd failed them. The vote was the vote. It's worth noting, in fairness to the complexity of this whole picture, that the system wasn't applied with perfect uniformity across every single pirate crew operating during this era. Edward Teach, the captain better known by his terrifying nickname, Blackbeard, ran things a little differently, at least at the height of his power. For a period, Teach commanded something closer to a small fleet than a single ship, with several vessels operating under his overall leadership, while individual captains retained authority over their own crews beneath him. A structure with more layers and more personal authority concentrated at the top than Robert's single-ship democracy. Blackbeard himself cultivated a deliberately terrifying personal image, reportedly weaving lit, slow-burning fuses into his beard before battle, so that he appeared to emerge from a cloud of smoke like something out of a nightmare, specifically to make enemy crews surrender without a fight, rather than risk casualties on either side. So the floating republic model wasn't an absolute law of physics, identical in every single case. It was a strong, repeating tendency, occasionally complicated by a captain charismatic or threatening enough to concentrate more power than the typical articles allowed. But even Blackbeard, for all his theatre, still operated within a broader pirate culture that expected some form of consultation and shared reward, because a captain who ignored that culture entirely risked the exact fate that met Charles Vane. It's worth knowing exactly what a fair share meant in concrete terms, because the numbers themselves tell you something about how these crews thought about hierarchy. Robert's articles, like most surviving examples, didn't pretend everyone aboard was identical in value to the venture, a navigator with real skill, or an officer who'd proven himself in command, was worth more to the crew's survival than an inexperienced hand fresh off a captured merchant ship, and the articles said so plainly. The captain and the quartermaster typically received something like 2 full shares of any plunder, recognising the weight of what they were responsible for. Specialised officers below them, the master gunner, the boatswain, sometimes the carpenter, might receive somewhere between 1 1/4 and 1 1/2 shares. Every ordinary crew member, regardless of how long he'd served or where he'd come from, received exactly 1 full share, the same as the man standing next to him. Compare that ratio to almost any legitimate ship of the era. A Royal Navy captain might earn many times what an ordinary sailor earned, with absolutely no transparency about where the rest of that money actually went, and no mechanism for an ordinary seaman to challenge it even if he'd wanted to. On a pirate ship, the entire pay structure was written down in advance, agreed to by everyone it applied to, and capped at a ratio that, by modern standards, would look almost startlingly modest. Roughly double for the 2 men carrying the most responsibility, and equal pay for everyone else, full stop. It wasn't socialism in any formal sense. Nobody aboard would have used or even understood that word. But it was, in practical terms, one of the flattest pay structures of the entire 18th century Atlantic world, built by men the rest of that world considered too lawless to organise anything at all. It's worth pausing too on just how successful this particular brand of structured piracy actually was, at least for a while, because the scale of it is easy to lose sight of in a story this focused on rules and committees. By the time of his death in 1722, Bartholomew Roberts and his various crews are estimated to have captured somewhere in the range of 400 vessels across barely 3 years of active piracy, ranging from small fishing boats to large merchant ships, off the coasts of West Africa, the Caribbean, and the eastern seaboard of the American colonies. 400 ships. 3 years, under a system run by elected officers, written contracts, and a crew that could fire its own captain. Whatever else you want to say about the morality of what these men were doing, and there's no getting around the fact that piracy meant violence, theft, and real human suffering for the people on the receiving end of it, it's hard to argue the structure wasn't, on its own narrow terms, extraordinarily effective. A poorly organised mob of 200 armed men does not generally manage to outmaneuver, outsail, and outfight the combined naval forces of multiple European empires for years at a stretch. A well-organised one, with clear lines of authority for exactly the moments that mattered, and genuine consultation for everything else, just might. And once you understand that the captain could be voted out, you start to understand everything else differently too. The articles weren't rules imposed from above by a tyrant who happened to also be a thief. They were closer to rules a group of equals had agreed to live under together, because every single one of them understood, intimately, what it felt like to live under rules they'd had no say in at all. But here's the thing. Once you start digging into exactly which behaviours these crews chose to regulate, the list gets a lot stranger and a lot more specific than don't mutiny or share the loot fairly. Some of the most heavily debated, most carefully worded rules in these documents weren't about violence or money at all. They were about something else entirely. Something that, on the surface, sounds almost domestic for a ship full of armed criminals. Chapter 3. No women, no boys allowed. Of all the rules we'll cover tonight, this next one might be the strangest, because of who ends up breaking it most spectacularly. A rule enforced by death. A rule broken, repeatedly, by some of the most successful pirates of the entire era, and almost nobody aboard ever said a word about it, until the law finally caught up with all of them at once. Let's clear something out of the way first, because it matters for what's coming. Forget the romantic pirate adventure version of this story, the swashbuckling captain with a woman on each arm in some tropical port, living a life of glamorous lawlessness. That image exists almost entirely in fiction. The real documented rule, written into the articles of multiple separate pirate crews, was the opposite of glamorous. It was a flat, blunt prohibition, no women and no boys allowed among the crew at all. Bartholomew Roberts's articles spelled it out directly. If any man was discovered sneaking a woman aboard disguised, or concealing her presence from the rest of the crew, the punishment was death. Not a fine, not expulsion. Death, other pirate crews of the same era, including the ship commanded by Captain John Phillips, had nearly identical clauses, and some versions went even further, explicitly stating that any man who used force against a woman taken from a captured ship would face the same fatal punishment. Why would a ship full of men who had already rejected society's laws bother enforcing a rule like this with such brutal consistency? The stated reasoning, as far as it's recorded, comes down to something almost painfully practical: jealousy and disorder. Picture the actual physical reality of one of these ships. Cramped, wooden, often no more than 80 or 100 feet long, holding anywhere from 50 to 200 men who depended on each other completely for survival. There was nowhere to go to cool off after an argument. No private space to retreat to. Every grudge, every rivalry, every romantic entanglement would be playing out in full view of a crew that needed absolute unity to survive an attack, a storm, or a mutiny attempt from within their own ranks. The fear wasn't really about women themselves. It was about what competition over a woman's attention could do to the fragile trust holding 200 armed men together in a wooden box in the middle of the ocean. One jealous fight could fracture loyalties that the entire crew's survival depended on. Here's what genuinely surprised me when I first dug into this part of the story, though, despite this rule. Despite the explicit death penalty attached to it, some of the most fearsome, most feared pirates of this exact era were women, hiding in plain sight. Anne Bonny and Mary Read sailed together aboard a ship commanded by the pirate Calico Jack Rackham, and according to the surviving trial records from their eventual capture, both women fought in battle dressed in men's clothing, wielding cutlasses and pistols alongside the rest of the crew, with witnesses describing them as among the most aggressive fighters aboard the ship, more willing to fight than some of the men, according to testimony given at the time. Mary Read, by some accounts, had spent years of her life disguised as a man even before turning to piracy, having served in both the army and navy under male identity long before she ever set foot on a pirate ship. When the ship was finally captured by a Jamaican privateer, the story goes that most of the male crew were too drunk or too frightened to fight back, while Bonny and Read stood on deck and fought until they were overwhelmed. Mary Read's path to that deck is, on its own, a story dense enough to fill an entire night by itself. According to the most detailed surviving account, published not long after her trial, Read's mother had disguised her as a boy from a very young age, not for any adventurous reason, but for cold financial necessity, in order to claim support from a relative who believed the family's surviving child was male. Read apparently grew so accustomed to the disguise that she kept it long after the original financial reason had passed. She served as a soldier in a foot regiment and later in a cavalry unit, fighting on European battlefields entirely undetected as a woman, by most accounts a competent and unremarkable soldier among thousands of others, which was, in its own way, exactly the point. She fell in love with a fellow soldier at one point, reportedly revealing her identity to him alone, married him, and briefly tried something like an ordinary life running an inn after he died, until financial hardship pushed her back to sea, back into men's clothing, and eventually onto a ship that was captured by pirates, who gave her a choice familiar to many captured sailors of the era: join us, or take your chances elsewhere. What's worth sitting with here isn't just the specific biography, remarkable as it is. It's what her life says about how flexible the rules around gender presentation could become. The instant survival or opportunity demanded it. Read wasn't hiding among pirates uniquely. She'd been hiding, successfully, inside the most rigidly regimented institutions Europe had to offer, the army, the navy, for years before piracy ever entered the picture. If a woman could pass undetected through the heart of conventional military life, fighting alongside men who never suspected a thing, then a pirate crew's written ban on women aboard was never really airtight to begin with. It was a rule about openly, visibly bringing a woman aboard as a woman. It said considerably less about a woman willing and able to simply become, for all practical purposes, one of the crew. Anne Bonny's own road to that same deck looked nothing like Mary Read's, which makes their partnership all the more interesting. Bonny was born in Ireland, the illegitimate daughter of a lawyer and one of his household servants, a scandal serious enough that the family eventually emigrated to the American colonies to escape the gossip, settling in South Carolina, where her father went on to build a successful plantation. By most accounts, Bonny grew up with a fierce, often volatile temper even as a girl, and a documented impatience with the quiet, respectable life her father's money could have bought her. She married a small-time sailor named James Bonny, while still young, against her father's wishes, and the marriage cost her whatever inheritance she might otherwise have expected. The couple drifted to Nassau, that loosely governed pirate haven, where Anne reportedly grew bored and unimpressed with her husband's caution, and with his willingness to inform on other pirates to the colonial authorities for reward money. She left him for Rackham, a far more committed and daring pirate captain, and by the time Mary Read joined that same crew, Bonny was already established as one of its most fearless members. Two women then, arriving from almost opposite directions, one pushed into men's clothing by financial necessity from early childhood, the other walking away from genuine privilege out of restlessness and a documented hunger for a freer, more dangerous life, ending up on the same small deck, fighting the same battle, defying the very same death penalty clause, side by side. Doesn't that completely undercut the rule we just described? A crew with a documented death penalty for women aboard ship, and yet two of the most effective fighters in their own famous crew were women the entire time, known to at least some of their shipmates, tolerated, accepted, and apparently respected enough to fight beside without incident. What that tells you, I think, is something important about how rules like this actually function in any tightly bound group of people, then or now. The written rule existed because the crew, as an institution, genuinely feared what unrestricted romantic chaos could do to their unity and survival. But individual human relationships, trust built over months at sea, respect earned through genuine skill and courage, could and did bend that rule when the people involved had proven themselves as crewmates first, regardless of what the paper said. The rule was about protecting the group from disorder. It wasn't really, in practice, about punishing the existence of women specifically. It was about punishing whatever behaviour threatened to tear the crew apart. Their story didn't end on that deck, either, and the ending is worth knowing, even if it isn't a happy one. When Bonny, Reed and the rest of Rackham's crew were finally put on trial in Jamaica in 1720, both women were convicted of piracy alongside the men. Under the law of the time, execution could be delayed for a pregnant woman until after she gave birth, and both Bonny and Reed reportedly told the court they were pregnant, which automatically postponed their hanging. Mary Reed never left prison alive long enough to find out what would happen next. She died there, of a fever, before any execution date could be carried out. Anne Bonny's fate afterward is genuinely uncertain. The historical record simply goes quiet, with no confirmed account of an execution, a pardon, or a release, leaving historians to debate what actually became of her. It's an oddly fitting end for a woman whose entire life on that ship was defined by slipping past the boundaries everyone assumed would contain her. There's something worth carrying with you from this part of the story, beyond the specific facts. These were people without a home to return to in any conventional sense, no family waiting with open arms, no legal identity they could safely resume, no institution anywhere that considered their well-being its responsibility. Whatever loyalty existed between Bonny, Reed, and the rest of that crew wasn't sentimental in the way we might use that word today. It was load-bearing. It was, quite literally, one of the only structures keeping any of them from being utterly alone in a world that had already decided they didn't matter. When people describe pirate crews as a kind of found family, centuries before that phrase existed, this is usually the sort of story they mean, not a cosy fantasy of camaraderie, but the much harder, much more real fact that for some people, the only family available is the one assembled out of necessity, on a wooden deck in the middle of an ocean that didn't care whether any of them lived or died. The no boys half of this same clause carries a quieter, more practical explanation. Young boys, often orphaned, abandoned, or simply desperate enough to take any work available, were common aboard legitimate naval and merchant ships of this era, typically serving in support roles. On a pirate ship, where every single body needed to be capable of fighting, hauling rigging, and pulling their weight in a fight for their lives, an unskilled boy represented one more mouth to feed and one more body to protect, with comparatively little he could contribute in return. Some historians studying these articles also note that limiting the presence of boys aboard removed a category of vulnerable people from a violent, lawless environment where the normal protections of family or community simply didn't exist. Either way, the clause reflects the same underlying logic running through almost every rule we've discussed so far tonight. These weren't moral pronouncements handed down from on high. They were the practical decisions of men trying to keep a fragile, dangerous community functioning, with absolutely no safety net beneath them if it fell apart. And that brings up something worth sitting with for a moment, away from the specific facts of the rule itself. Have you ever been part of a group, even something as ordinary as a workplace, or a close circle of friends, where the unwritten rules existed entirely to protect something fragile that everyone depended on, even if nobody ever said that part out loud? That's what was happening here, just with far higher stakes than anything most of us will ever face. These men had nothing, no homeland that would take them back without a noose waiting, no family structure most of them could return to, no legal protection of any kind from any nation on earth. The crew itself, flawed, violent, often short-lived as it was the only safety net any of them had left. Every rule that sounds strange or even cruel from 300 years of distance was, underneath it, an attempt to protect the one thing standing between these men and complete annihilation, each other. That's worth remembering as we keep going tonight, because the next rule we're about to look at sounds, on the surface, almost comically mundane for a den of armed criminals, and yet it comes from exactly the same place. Fear, not of each other this time, but of something far more immediate. Fire, Chapter 4. Lights out by 8 now, stay with me, because what happens next will surprise you, simply because of how ordinary it sounds at first. Bartholomew Roberts' articles included a specific curfew. Lights and candles, the rule stated, were to be extinguished by 8 o'clock at night. If any of the crew wished to keep drinking past that hour, they were permitted to do so, but only up on the open deck, without any flame at all. A bedtime. For pirates. Doesn't that sound almost like a punchline? It isn't one, and once you understand the actual physics of an 18th century sailing ship, the rule stops sounding strange at all. It starts sounding like the only sane decision available. Picture the construction of one of these vessels for a moment. The entire hull, every plank, every beam, was wood that had typically been treated with tar and pitch to make it waterproof, both of which are, not coincidentally, extremely flammable. Below deck, in the hold, sat the ship's entire supply of gunpowder, often stored in wooden barrels, because that's simply what gunpowder was kept in at the time. A single stray spark, a single candle knocked over by a drunk or careless hand in the dark, had the potential to ignite that powder and destroy the entire ship, and every single person aboard, in a matter of seconds. There was no fire brigade to call, no emergency services. If your ship caught fire in the middle of the Atlantic at 2 a.m, your odds of survival dropped close to 0 almost instantly. Try to picture it with your other senses for a moment, not just the facts of it. Below decks on a ship like this, the air itself would have been thick, a mix of saltwater damp, unwashed bodies packed into a space never designed for comfort, the sharp tang of tar sealing the timbers, and underneath all of it, drifting up from the hold, the faint mineral smell of stored gunpowder. No electric lighting, obviously, just the warm, flickering, genuinely beautiful light of candle flame or oil lanterns, the same light that makes a room feel cosy and safe in almost any other context. Every man aboard would have grown up around open flame his entire life. It would have felt as natural and unthreatening as the air itself. And that's exactly what made it dangerous. Familiarity breeds carelessness, and carelessness, in a wooden box sitting on top of several tons of explosive powder, was the one thing nobody could afford. Picture too the specific moment the curfew arrived, however that signal was given on a particular ship, a bell, a shout, simply the captain or quartermaster making his rounds. Men setting down cards mid-hand, a candle pinched out between wet fingers, the room dropping into near total darkness except for whatever moonlight made it through a hatch above. Some men grumbling, certainly. This was still a curfew after all, and pirates weren't exactly famous for loving rules imposed on their personal time. But compliance, by most accounts, was reasonably consistent, because every man in that darkened room understood, at some level deeper than resentment, that he was sleeping a few feet above enough stored explosive force to turn the entire ship into splinters in less time than it takes to finish a sentence. Fear, when it's specific and well-founded enough, has a way of overriding even a pirate's notorious resistance to being told what to do. What did that actually mean in day-to-day terms? It meant that on a pirate ship, fire wasn't treated as a minor household inconvenience. It was treated the way we might treat handling industrial explosives today, because that's essentially what it was. The curfew on candles wasn't about discipline for its own sake, or some captain's personal preference for an early night. It was a direct, practical response to the single most catastrophic risk these men faced that had nothing to do with cannon fire, storms, or the Royal Navy at all. and the fire precautions didn't stop at bedtime. Several surviving sets of pirate articles included rules about pipe smoking below deck, requiring that any pipe be capped or covered to prevent a stray ember from escaping near the powder stores. Roberts' articles also explicitly required that every man keep his pistol and cutlass clean and fit for service, language straight out of the document itself, with the captain or quartermaster empowered to inspect weapons and punish neglect. That might sound like simple military tidiness, but think about what a dirty, rusted pistol actually meant in the moment that counted most. In a surprise attack, in the chaos of a chase, a weapon that misfired because nobody had bothered to clean it wasn't just an inconvenience. It was a death sentence for the man holding it and potentially for the crewmates depending on him. Here's what the movies never show you. Pirates weren't reckless with the things that actually mattered for survival. They were reckless with the things that didn't. They'd happily gamble away their share of plunder, drink themselves into oblivion on captured rum, and take wild risks chasing down a target 3 times their own ship's size. But ask them to leave a candle burning unattended near the powder magazine, or carry a rusted pistol into a fight, and suddenly you're looking at some of the most disciplined risk management of the entire 18th century. Picture a weapons inspection itself, because the surviving articles make clear this wasn't a casual once-over. On Roberts's ship, and several others with similar clauses, the captain or quartermaster would walk the deck checking each man's pistol and cutlass directly, testing the action of a flintlock mechanism, running a finger along a blade edge to check for rust or dullness, asking a man to demonstrate that his weapon was loaded and primed correctly. A man whose weapon failed this inspection wasn't simply told to do better next time. Punishments documented in various articles range from a docked share of plunder to physical punishment, scaled to how serious or repeated the failure was. Compare that to how casually these same men treated, say, a card game with money on the line, or a contest to see who could drink the most captured rum the fastest, and the contrast becomes almost funny. These were not men who lacked the capacity for discipline. They simply reserved that discipline exclusively for the handful of things that could actually get the whole crew killed, and let absolutely everything else run as wild as it wanted to. There's a kind of clarity in that approach that's almost enviable, honestly, even now. Most of us spend energy worrying about things that, if we're honest, wouldn't actually end us if they went wrong. A pirate crew didn't have the luxury of confusing the two categories. The stakes were too real, too immediate, too final. So the line between things we regulate strictly and things we let go completely got drawn with brutal clarity, and once it was drawn, everybody understood exactly which side of that line they were standing on at any given moment. Maybe that's part of why these rules, strange as they sound to us now, never seem to have provoked much resentment in the surviving record. They weren't arbitrary. Every man aboard could trace a direct, visible line from the rule itself to the specific catastrophe it was preventing. And once you can see that line clearly, a curfew stops feeling like control. It starts feeling like the only thing standing between you and the dark, silent, freezing water outside the hull. It's worth pausing on why their relationship to risk was so specific like this. Legitimate sailors of this era, serving the Royal Navy or a merchant company, had at least some structure to fall back on if disaster struck. An injured sailor on a Navy ship might eventually receive some care, or at least a discharge. A merchant crew that lost their ship to fire might be picked up by another vessel and have a government or company back home to eventually answer to. Pirates had none of that. No nation claimed them. No port would openly welcome them without risk of arrest. If their ship burned, sank, or were captured, there was no institution anywhere in the world obligated to help them. That isolation, that complete absence of any backup plan, is exactly why the precautions that did exist had to be taken so seriously. When you have no safety net of any kind, the few precautions within your control become non-negotiable, because they're the only thing standing between you and disaster. Can you imagine living with that level of constant calculation, knowing that the smallest careless mistake, a candle left burning, a damp pistol left to rust, could end not just your life, but the lives of everyone you'd come to depend on, with absolutely no one coming to help afterward? That's the reality these rules were quietly managing every single night on every pirate ship that took fire safety seriously enough to write it into law. There's a strange kind of freedom buried inside all of this if you sit with it long enough. We tend to think of rules and freedom as opposites: more rules, less freedom, and vice versa. But ask anyone who has lived through real chaos, real unpredictability, whether they'd trade some structure for the certainty of knowing exactly what's expected of them, and exactly what will happen if they fail to deliver it, and most people choose the structure every time. A pirate who knew the precise hour his candle had to be out, and precisely why, wasn't a man living under tyranny. He was a man who got to stop wondering. He didn't have to lie awake calculating whether tonight was the night some careless shipmate burned them all alive, because the rule already existed, already applied to everyone equally, and already removed that particular fear from the list of things he had to personally manage. In a life with almost no other certainties, no guaranteed tomorrow, no guaranteed safe harbour, no guarantee the next ship on the horizon wasn't a Royal Navy frigate, that kind of narrow, specific predictability was its own form of relief, maybe even its own form of rest, in exactly the way you're hoping to find some of right now. That's coming up next, in a sense, because the deeper we go into these articles, the more this pattern repeats itself. Behind almost every rule that sounds strange or excessive at first glance is a piece of cold. Practical calculation about survival in an environment with zero margin for error. The bedtime wasn't really about bedtime. The weapons inspection wasn't really about tidiness. They were about staying alive one more night, one more chase, one more storm, in a world that offered these men nothing else. But first, here's where things are about to take a genuinely strange turn, because the next part of this story isn't about safety at all. It's about money, and specifically about a kind of financial protection that, frankly, most working people on land in the early 1700s couldn't have dreamed of having. Something that sounds, on paper, almost unbelievably progressive for a ship flying a flag that meant certain death if the Royal Navy ever caught up with it. We'll get into exactly what that looked like, and exactly how much a pirate's missing arm or eye was actually worth, very soon. For now, let that settle. A floating republic. A captain who served at the pleasure of his crew. A community bound together less by greed than by the simple, desperate need to protect each other from a world that had already cast every one of them out. We've only just begun to understand how deep that structure actually went. The question of what a pirate's missing arm or eye was actually worth, written down in black and white in a contract signed by criminals. The answer, according to Bartholomew Roberts's articles, was specific. A man who lost a limb or was permanently crippled in the line of duty was entitled to 800 pieces of 8, the Spanish silver dollar that functioned as the closest thing to a universal currency anywhere in the Atlantic world at the time, paid out of what the articles called the common stock, before a single coin of that haul was divided into personal shares for anyone, captain included. Lesser injuries were compensated on a sliding scale, proportionate to the severity of what had been lost. This wasn't a vague promise, the kind of thing a desperate man might be told to keep him fighting, then quietly forgotten once the battle was over and the adrenaline had faded. It was written down, in advance, voted on by the same men it would eventually apply to, and enforceable the same way every other clause in the articles was enforceable, by the collective will of the crew itself. Doesn't that sound almost unbelievable? A disability payout, negotiated and ratified by outlaws, written into a contract roughly 300 years before any government on the planet would build anything resembling it into law. Picture the actual moment this rule would have applied, because it makes everything more real than simply hearing the numbers. A cannon shot tears across the deck during a chase that's turned into a fight. A man near the rail goes down, his leg shattered below the knee, screaming in a way that cuts through even the noise of battle. In the chaos of that exact second, with smoke still hanging in the air and the outcome of the fight still very much undecided, nobody aboard is thinking about Article 9 of the agreement they signed back in port. They're thinking about getting him below, getting the bleeding stopped, getting back to their own post before the next volley arrives. But once the fighting ends, once the prize is taken or the enemy ship has fled, that wounded man isn't simply left to fend for himself, dependent entirely on whatever sympathy his crewmates happen to feel toward him personally. The articles already settled the question before it was ever asked. He is owed 800 pieces of 8, not as a favour, not as charity extended by a captain in a generous mood, as a debt the entire crew had already agreed, collectively and in advance, that it owed him. Picture what the common stock actually meant in practice, because it's worth understanding as more than just an abstract legal term. Before any plunder was split into individual shares, before the captain took his 2 shares, before the quartermaster took his, before the ordinary crewman pocketed his single share, a portion of everything captured was set aside entirely, untouched by anyone's personal claim. This shared fund covered exactly the kind of unpredictable, catastrophic cost that no individual pirate could ever plan for on his own. A man's leg, taken off cleanly by a cannonball mid-fight. An eye, lost to a splinter thrown loose by an exploding section of mast. A hand, mangled beyond any future use in the chaos of a boarding action. It also quietly covered other shared necessities, replacement rope and canvas, repairs to a hull damaged in a storm, fresh provisions when a long stretch at sea had emptied the stores. The common stock existed because the crew understood something that takes most people years of adult life to fully absorb, that disaster doesn't announce itself politely in advance, and the only real protection against it is something built before you need it, not promised hastily after. It's worth understanding, too, just how real and immediate that risk actually was. Every single day these men spent at sea. Medicine in the early 1700s offered almost nothing in the way of genuine pain relief or infection control. A serious wound to a limb was often treated by amputation, performed quickly, by whichever man aboard had the steadiest hands, sometimes an actual ship's surgeon, more often the carpenter, using the same saw he might otherwise use on timber. The stump was frequently sealed with hot tar or a heated blade, less out of any real medical understanding, and more because it was the only method available with any real chance of stopping the bleeding. Survival wasn't guaranteed even after the cutting was done. Infection in the weeks that followed killed plenty of men who had technically survived the injury itself. Knowing all of that, knowing exactly how close every single battle brought a man to that exact outcome, makes the existence of a guaranteed payout feel less like generosity and more like basic, clear-eyed realism. These men weren't being kind for kindness' sake. They were looking squarely at the worst thing that could happen to any one of them, and deciding, together, that it shouldn't also mean total ruin. Now compare that to what happened to an ordinary sailor on a Royal Navy ship, or a merchant vessel, who lost a limb in the exact same kind of battle, fighting for entirely legal reasons under an entirely legal flag. There was no equivalent fund waiting for him. England did maintain a single institution, the Royal Hospital for Seamen at Greenwich, intended to support disabled and elderly Navy veterans, but its capacity was limited, its admission far from automatic, and it offered nothing at all to the much larger population of merchant sailors, who made up a significant share of the men who eventually turned to piracy in the first place. For most injured sailors, the realistic outcome was simpler and bleaker. If the captain happened to be a decent man, an injured sailor might receive a small discharge payment, or a letter of recommendation that meant very little to anyone who couldn't read. If he was unlucky, and most were, he was simply put ashore, no longer fit for service, owed wages that often hadn't actually been paid in full. From there, his options were grim, beg, lean on family who might not have the means to help him, or, in the worst cases, end up entirely dependent on a parish poorhouse. An institution built more to discourage reliance on it than to genuinely support the people inside it. Can you imagine giving years of your life, risking your body in someone else's war, and discovering that the moment you are no longer useful, you simply ceased to matter to the people who'd asked everything of you? That was the normal outcome, not the rare, unlucky exception, the normal outcome, for an enormous number of working sailors across the entire 18th century. Here's what genuinely surprised me when I first came across this part of the story. The idea of a structured, pre-agreed, pooled fund to cover the cost of injury, what we would now instantly recognise as the basic architecture of an insurance policy, didn't appear in any organised large-scale form in mainstream European society for roughly another 150 years. Germany is usually credited with building the first real government-run social insurance system covering workplace injury in the 1880s under Chancellor Otto von Bismarck. Britain followed decades after that. The United States took even longer still. And yet here, on a ship flying a flag that meant instant execution the moment the wrong navy caught up with it, a group of violent criminals with no legal standing anywhere on earth had already worked out the basic logic on their own, sometime around 1720, purely because they understood, intimately and personally, exactly what it felt like to have nothing standing between themselves and total ruin. And the articles went further still. Several surviving sets, including versions associated with Roberts's crew, included a clause stating that the company would not break up, would not disband, divide its final assets, and scatter until every single man aboard had accumulated £1,000 from the shared venture. Think about what that actually prevented. It meant a captain couldn't simply seize the single largest prize of his career, declare the voyage a triumph, and sail off into a comfortable retirement while leaving half his crew with nothing to show for the risks they'd taken alongside him. It meant the men who'd joined later, or who'd had a run of bad luck capturing smaller, less valuable ships, weren't quietly left behind while luckier crewmates cashed out early and vanished. Everyone's fortune was tied to everyone else's, by design, written into the contract before a single man could even seriously consider walking away alone. Have you ever been part of something? A team, a long project, a hard stretch of shared work where you worried a little less about your own outcome specifically because you knew, with real certainty, that nobody was allowed to simply walk away and leave you behind? That feeling of genuinely shared risk paired with genuinely shared reward is rare even now, in workplaces with lawyers and human resources departments and centuries of labour law behind them. It was rarer still in 1720, and these particular men, who had every reason in the world to look out only for themselves, given how completely the rest of society had already abandoned them, built it into law anyway. It's worth remembering, too, who was actually responsible for guarding all of this. We talked earlier about the quartermaster's role as a kind of check on the captain's power, controlling the distribution of plunder and settling disputes before they turned violent. The common stock fell squarely under that same authority. It was the quartermaster, not the captain, who was generally trusted to keep an honest account of what had been set aside, and to make sure that when a man came forward missing an eye or a hand, the promised payment actually arrived, in full, without the captain quietly diverting it elsewhere for his own benefit. That detail matters because it shows the disability payout wasn't a one-off act of generosity dreamed up in a moment of sentiment. It was embedded into the entire structure of checks and balances we already spent an entire chapter unpacking. Proof that these systems weren't separate ideas bolted together at random, but pieces of one consistent philosophy about keeping dangerous men from destroying each other and themselves. Some surviving accounts describe the common stock as being kept quite literally under lock, in a chest accessible only with the quartermaster present, sometimes requiring more than one man's agreement to open it at all, an early, crude version of what a modern accountant might recognise as a dual control system, designed specifically to prevent any single person from quietly helping himself. It's a small operational detail, but it tells you something about how seriously these men took the difference between a promise and a guarantee. A promise can be broken quietly, by one man, when nobody else is looking. A guarantee, locked behind a system that requires more than one set of hands to access, is much harder to quietly betray. It's also worth noticing who exactly this protection covered. It wasn't reserved for officers, or for men who'd proven some special value to the crew. The newest, least experienced hand aboard, the man who'd perhaps only joined a few weeks earlier, captured off some merchant ship and given the usual choice of joining or being marooned, was entitled to exactly the same 800 pieces of 8 if he lost a limb as the most seasoned veteran on board. In a world utterly obsessed with rank, birth and inherited privilege, where the eventual size of your inheritance was usually decided before you'd done anything at all to deserve it, that kind of flat, status-blind guarantee was almost unheard of. Your body was worth the same, on paper, as everyone else's. That alone might be one of the most quietly radical sentences in the entire set of articles. Step back for a moment and consider how strange this entire arrangement would have looked to almost anyone else alive in 1720, on either side of the law. A subsistence farmer, a domestic servant, a soldier in a standing army, none of them had anything close to a contractual right to compensation if their body failed them in the course of their work. The very idea that a working person's body carried a fixed, agreed, collectively guaranteed value would have struck most of European society as either absurd or dangerously radical, depending on who you asked. These men weren't drawing on some grand tradition of labour rights they'd inherited from anywhere, and they certainly weren't following anyone's example. They built the entire concept themselves, from nothing, on the deck of a stolen ship, simply because they'd already lost everything else society normally offers in exchange for obedience, and decided that whatever they built next would actually protect them. What would it take, do you think, for any group of people to build something this fair from scratch, with no model to copy and nobody forcing their hand? There's a meaningful difference, too, between charity and a contract, and these men clearly understood which one they were building. Charity depends on someone else's goodwill, offered or withdrawn at their discretion, with no guarantee and no real recourse if it's denied. A contract is something you can actually stand on. It doesn't ask whether the captain happens to feel generous that week. It simply states what is owed, to whom, and under what conditions, and then holds every signatory to it regardless of mood, friendship, or favouritism. The pirates aboard Robert's ship weren't hoping their captain might take pity on them if disaster struck. They had already removed pity from the equation entirely, replacing it with something far more reliable, an enforceable right, agreed to in advance by every man who would ever need to claim it. Maybe that's worth sitting with for a moment yourself, right now, as you settle in. So much of what keeps any of us awake at night, turning a worry over and over without resolving it, comes down to uncertainty, not knowing what would actually happen if the worst happened. These men, living lives almost unimaginably more dangerous than anything most of us will ever face, had at least solved that one particular uncertainty for themselves. They knew in advance exactly what would happen if their body failed them. There's a strange kind of calm in that, even read about from 300 years away. But here's the thing. Not every rule on a pirate ship existed to protect people. Some existed purely to stop the crew from tearing itself apart through its own worst instincts. And one of those rules carried a punishment so quiet, so isolating, that some historians who study this period have argued it was, in its own strange way, crueler than simply being killed outright. That's coming up next, but first, let's understand exactly what these men were trying to prevent in the first place. Chapter 6. The loneliest punishment at sea. Picture this. A man stands alone on a strip of sand barely large enough to pace across in 30 steps. Behind him, low scrub and a few wind-bent palms, nothing more. In front of him, the ship that was, until an hour ago, his entire world, already shrinking toward the horizon, sails full, not slowing, not turning back. In his hand a single pistol, a small measure of powder and shot, and a bottle of water that won't last more than a day or two if the sun is unkind. That's the whole of it. That's everything he has left. This was marooning, and it wasn't a myth invented for adventure novels generations later. It was a real, documented punishment, written directly into the articles of multiple pirate crews, reserved for offences serious enough that the crew judged outright execution almost too quick a mercy. But before we get to that, we need to understand the smaller rules this one grew out of, because marooning didn't exist in isolation. It sat at the harsh end of a whole spectrum of rules built to manage exactly one thing: the everyday friction of putting desperate, armed men in close quarters with each other for months at a time. Take gambling. Roberts' articles banned it outright, specifically gambling for money, cards or dice, anywhere aboard the ship. On the surface, that might sound almost puritanical for a crew of supposed hedonists who drank captured rum without limit and took wild risks chasing prizes 3 times their own size. But the logic, once again, was entirely practical rather than moral. Gambling creates debt. Debt creates resentment. And resentment, left to fester in a space as cramped and inescapable as the lower deck of a wooden ship, has nowhere to go except sideways, into a grudge that eventually turns violent. A man who'd lost his entire share of the last prize to a crewmate over a bad hand of cards wasn't just embarrassed. He was suddenly someone with a real motive to want that crewmate dead, sharing cramped quarters with him every single night, with weapons within easy reach of both of them. Banning gambling for money wasn't about virtue. It was about removing one more variable that could turn ordinary men into murderers of their own crewmates, in an environment where every single man's survival depended on the others not wanting him dead. Here's a smaller, stranger rule that comes from exactly the same instinct. When a pirate crew successfully boarded and captured a ship, the goods aboard weren't simply formally divided according to the articles and nothing more. Beyond the official shares, there were often desirable personal items: fine clothing, a particularly good set of pistols, a watch. Anything valuable enough to be worth fighting over informally. Several sets of articles addressed this directly, establishing an order, sometimes decided by lot, sometimes by an agreed rotation, for who got first choice of these extra items, rather than simply letting whoever grabbed fastest or hit hardest walk away with the best of it. It's such a small, almost bureaucratic detail, and yet it tells you again exactly how seriously these men took the idea that disorder over property was the single fastest route to disorder over everything else. Think for a moment about how this single instinct, regulate the small things precisely because the stakes are too high to leave anything to chance, threads through literally every rule we've covered across both halves of tonight's story. The bedtime curfew wasn't really about sleep. The weapons inspection wasn't really about tidiness. The ban on women aboard wasn't really about morality. And these rules around gambling and looting order weren't really about cards or coats. Each one, traced back to its root, comes from the exact same place: a crew of men with absolutely no external authority to fall back on, deciding, again and again, that the cost of leaving even small sources of friction unaddressed was simply too high to risk. They weren't paranoid. They were precise. There's a real difference between the two, and these men, whatever else you want to say about them, consistently landed on the right side of it. Why would a crew of violent men bother regulating something as petty as who gets first pick of a dead captain's coat? Because pettiness, left unmanaged, is exactly what destroys groups that depend completely on trust to survive. It's rarely the big betrayals that end a crew. It's the small ones, left to accumulate, one unfair grab at a time. Which brings us back to marooning itself, the consequence waiting at the very end of that spectrum, for the offences these smaller rules couldn't prevent. Desertion in the heat of battle, theft from the common stock, hiding plunder from the rest of the crew instead of declaring it for the shared accounting, striking a fellow crewman aboard ship rather than settling the matter properly, ashore, with witnesses, the way we discussed back in Chapter 2. For crimes like these, a captain and quartermaster, backed by the crew's vote, could choose between 2 sentences: death or marooning. It's worth understanding, too, how a man actually arrived at that sentence in the first place, because the process mirrored everything else we've discussed about pirate justice tonight. A formal accusation would be raised, usually by whoever had witnessed the offence. The quartermaster, often acting in something close to a judicial role, would hear out both sides, the accuser and the accused, before the matter went to a vote of the assembled crew. There was no professional judge, no defence attorney in any formal sense, and certainly no appeal to a higher court once the vote was cast. But there was at minimum a process, an accusation stated openly, a chance to respond, and a decision made collectively rather than handed down by a single furious captain in the heat of the moment. Even the worst punishment these men could inflict on each other passed through that same structure of consultation and consent that defined almost everything else about how they governed themselves. It's a strange comfort in a way, even now, knowing that even their cruelty followed a process, rather than erupting at random. What marooning actually involved varied somewhat from crew to crew, but the broad shape of it was consistent enough to be almost ritualized. The condemned man would be put ashore on the smallest, most isolated scrap of land the ship happened to be near, frequently an uninhabited sandbar or a tiny island too small to support any real settlement, chosen specifically because it offered no realistic chance of escape and no realistic hope of rescue. He was typically given almost nothing. A pistol, a small amount of powder and a single shot, sometimes literally just one. A little water. Occasionally nothing at all beyond the clothes on his back. That single shot is worth sitting with for a moment, because of what it actually represented. It wasn't there for hunting, there was generally nothing on these scraps of land worth hunting. It wasn't there for defence against other people, there usually weren't any. It existed by most historical interpretations as a kind of grim acknowledgement, built into the punishment itself, that the man being left behind might eventually face a choice between a slow ordeal of thirst and exposure, and a fast one, entirely on his own terms. Even at its harshest, this particular system of justice still carried a strange, dark thread of consideration for the condemned man's suffering, however small a comfort that single bullet could possibly have offered. There's a real story from this exact era that captures just how survivable and how culturally enormous this particular fate could become, even though it didn't happen aboard a pirate ship exactly. In 1704, a Scottish sailing master named Alexander Selkirk, serving aboard an English privateering vessel called the Cinque Ports, got into a serious dispute with his captain over how seaworthy their ship actually was. Selkirk was convinced the vessel wouldn't survive much longer at sea. Rather than risk going down with it, he asked to be put ashore, alone, on an uninhabited island in the Juan Fernandez archipelago off the coast of Chile. His captain agreed. Because this was a voluntary arrangement rather than a punishment, Selkirk was allowed to keep his own weapons, tools, and a modest store of provisions, considerably more than a punished pirate would typically be granted under marooning proper. He survived alone on that island for more than 4 years, hunting wild goats descended from earlier shipwrecks, building shelters, and slowly adapting to a complete absence of any other human contact, until he was finally spotted and rescued by another privateering ship in 1709. His story spread quickly once he returned to England, and a decade later, in 1719, right in the thick of the exact Golden Age of Piracy we've spent tonight exploring, a writer named Daniel Defoe published a novel inspired heavily by Selkirk's ordeal. You almost certainly know it. It was called Robinson Crusoe, and it remains one of the most influential adventure stories ever written in the English language. The fear that gave marooning its terrible weight among actual pirate crews, the fear of total, indefinite isolation with no way to know if rescue was even possible, became almost simultaneously one of the most popular entertainments in Europe. People paid money to imagine, comfortably from the safety of an armchair, exactly the nightmare that real pirates lived in genuine terror of facing themselves. Have you ever felt truly, completely alone, not just physically by yourself, but cut off, with no one coming, no message getting through, no certainty that anyone even knew where you were? Most of us, thankfully, only brush up against that feeling for a few hours at most, in a delayed flight or a phone with no signal in unfamiliar territory, and even then we know, somewhere underneath the discomfort, that the isolation is temporary. Marooning offered no such certainty. A marooned man had no way of knowing whether another ship would ever pass close enough to spot him, whether anyone would ever come looking, or whether his exact position would simply be forgotten the moment his old crew's sails dropped below the horizon. That total, open-ended uncertainty is very likely why some historians argue marooning was, psychologically, a harder sentence to carry than execution. Death, however violent, has an ending built into it. Marooning offered nothing but waiting, with no way to know what, if anything, the waiting was even for. It's a genuinely unsettling thought to sit with, I know, but it's worth understanding fully because it tells you something true about the entire system we've been exploring tonight. These weren't soft rules, dressed up to sound progressive for a modern audience listening 300 years later. They were serious rules, with serious teeth. Built by men who understood that the freedom they'd built for themselves only worked because the consequences for breaking it were real enough to matter. There's a quieter, sadder layer to this worth mentioning too, before we move somewhere warmer. Most marooned men were never seen again, their fate unrecorded, simply absent from whatever account survives of that crew's later voyages. A handful of stories did survive, passed down and partly mythologized over the following decades, of men who endured weeks alone on some forgotten spit of sand, and were, against every reasonable expectation, eventually spotted and rescued by a passing ship. Though how much of any individual telling is verified fact, and how much grew in the retelling is genuinely difficult to untangle this far. Removed from the events themselves, what we can say with confidence is simpler and somehow heavier for the men who lived under these articles. Marooning wasn't an abstract threat from a storybook. It was a real, known, witnessed outcome, one that had almost certainly happened to someone they'd actually sailed with. It's worth remembering that the power of this rule probably had less to do with how often it was actually used, and more to do with the fact that everyone aboard knew it was there, sitting quietly in the background of every decision they made. A man tempted to slip a few stolen coins into his own pocket instead of declaring them to the common stock had to weigh that small. Private gain against the very real possibility of standing on a strip of sand watching his crewmate's sails disappear forever. That kind of calculation, repeated quietly in the back of hundreds of men's minds across hundreds of ships, did far more to keep order than any single dramatic punishment ever could. Fear, used carefully and predictably, can function almost like another kind of insurance, not protecting the body this time, but protecting the fragile trust that let 200 armed strangers function as something resembling a community. And maybe it's worth noticing too that the men writing these articles understood something about fear that's easy to forget. The threat of isolation only works as a deterrent, because connection, ordinary daily human connection, is something people fundamentally don't want to lose. The harshest punishment a pirate crew could devise wasn't pain. It wasn't even necessarily death. It was simply taking away the one thing every single man aboard had built his entire fragile world around, the people standing next to him. But here's the thing. For every rule built on fear of disorder, there was another built on something gentler, proof that even inside a system this harsh, these men still found room for small, surprising kindnesses toward each other. One of those kindnesses involved, of all things, music, and it might be the detail that surprises you most tonight. Chapter 7. Sundays off. Even for thieves picture a pirate ship at dusk, sails slack in a gentle wind, the day's business done, no enemy on the horizon. And somewhere on that deck, a fiddle starts up. Not a battle hymn, not a war drum. Just music, the ordinary, human kind, played because someone aboard happened to be good at it, and the rest of the crew happened to enjoy listening. Most pirate crews of any real size carried at least one musician, and his role was taken seriously enough to be written directly into the articles. Robert's version of the document specifically addressed this, granting musicians rest on the Sabbath day, but stating plainly that the other 6 days and nights, none, without special favour. Think about what that actually meant for the man holding the fiddle or the drum. 6 days a week, he played essentially on demand, during the long, tedious stretches of open ocean to keep morale from collapsing into boredom and despair, during the loading and heaving of heavy cargo to keep the rhythm of hard physical labour steady, and, perhaps most strikingly, sometimes during the chaos of an actual attack, where music functioned almost like a psychological weapon meant to project confidence and intimidate a target crew into surrendering without a fight. It was, in its own way, one of the most demanding jobs on the entire ship. And yet, once a week, that demand stopped completely. Sunday belonged to him. Here's what nobody talks about. In any of the swashbuckling versions of this story, pirates building in protected rest time for their entertainer is such a small, mundane detail that it barely registers next to disability payouts and elected captains. But it might be the single most humanizing detail in the entire set of articles, precisely because it serves no obvious strategic purpose. The disability payout protected the crew's fighting strength. The voting system protected against tyranny. But protecting a musician's day off protected nothing except the musician's own basic well-being. There was no tactical advantage gained by letting him rest on Sundays instead of working him exactly as hard as everyone else, every single day. The only explanation left is the simplest one. These men, for all their violence, still recognized each other as people worth a small, specific kindness, even when nothing forced them to. It's easy to imagine these musical interludes as something grim or perfunctory, but surviving accounts suggest otherwise. Fiddles were the most common instrument by far, prized for being relatively compact and durable in damp sea air, though drums, trumpets, and even bagpipes show up in various records, depending on the nationality of the crew. Dancing wasn't unusual either, men taking turns or pairing off in whatever rough approximation of the steps they remembered from home, laughing in a way that has nothing at all to do with the bloodthirsty image stamped onto these same men by frightened merchants and prosecuting governments. Try holding both images in your mind at once, a crew capable of boarding a ship with cutlasses drawn, and the same crew, an hour later, stamping out a clumsy jig on the same deck while someone's fiddle squeaks slightly out of tune. Both things were real. Neither cancels the other out. And here's the question historians studying this period still circle back to, again and again: were these men monsters, exactly as the legal system of their time insisted? Or were they something messier and more human, desperate people, shaped by an unforgiving world, who nonetheless built small pockets of fairness and decency wherever they found room for it, even while doing genuinely violent and harmful things to others? The honest answer is probably both, held at the same time, the way most real human beings actually are, rather than the clean villain the courts needed them to be. Music wasn't the only small comfort these men carved out for themselves. Either long, otherwise empty stretches at sea were filled with the same things idle, isolated people have always reached for: storytelling, simple games, the trading of songs picked up from a dozen different ports and nationalities. Since pirate crews were often strikingly international, drawing in English, Welsh, Irish, Scottish, French and Dutch sailors alongside men of African descent, some of them former slaves who'd found, on a pirate ship, a freedom and rough equality of treatment that the colonial world on land would almost certainly never have offered them. None of this erases the real violence and theft these men were responsible for, and it would be dishonest to pretend otherwise. It simply complicates the cartoon version of them that survived into the present, the version with the eye patch and the parrot and nothing else underneath it. It's worth pausing on that last point a little longer, because it's one of the genuinely undertold parts of this entire era. Historians who've studied surviving crew lists, trial records, and witness testimony from this period have found that a meaningful number of pirate crews included black sailors, a significant portion of whom had escaped slavery, been liberated from captured slave ships, or simply joined a pirate crew as the single most realistic path towards something resembling freedom and equal standing available to them anywhere in the Atlantic world at the time. The exact proportion varied enormously from crew to crew. Some ships had only a handful of black sailors, others, by certain surviving accounts, had crews where black men made up a substantial share of the total complement, sometimes serving in the same combat roles, eligible for the same shares, bound by the same articles as everyone else aboard. This wasn't universal kindness, and it would be wrong to romanticize it into something it wasn't. Some pirate crews still bought and sold captured Africans as cargo, exactly like the legitimate slave trading vessels they sometimes targeted. But on at least some ships, for at least some men, piracy offered a version of the floating republic that extended further across racial lines than almost any other institution operating anywhere in the colonial Atlantic at the time, which tells you something stark about just how low the bar was everywhere else. Beyond music, beyond the trading of stories and songs, sailors of this era, pirate and legitimate alike, carried with them an entire private universe of superstition, much of it surprisingly specific. Whistling aboard ship was widely believed to summon storms, since the sound was thought to mimic and provoke the wind itself. Certain days, particularly Fridays, were considered unlucky for setting sail. Some crews refused to say the word drowned aloud, preferring euphemisms instead, as though naming the fear directly might somehow invite it. None of these beliefs had anything to do with the articles, or with any formal system of governance we've spent tonight unpacking. They existed simply because these were, underneath the violence and the legend, ordinary working men doing one of the most genuinely dangerous jobs available anywhere in their world, reaching for whatever small rituals made an unpredictable life feel even slightly more within their control. It's the same impulse, really, that makes a modern person knock on wood, or avoid walking under a ladder. Fear looking for somewhere harmless to go. Think about the small kindnesses that exist in your own life, the ones that don't actually accomplish anything strategic, that nobody would notice if they disappeared except the person they were aimed at. A co-worker covering for you so you can leave early. A friend remembering some tiny detail about your week and asking about it later. Those gestures don't keep an organization running. They don't increase anyone's profit. They exist purely because the people doing them still see each other as people. That instinct, it turns out, survives almost anywhere humans end up, even on a stolen ship, flying a death flag 300 years ago. It's worth asking, too, why a detail this small has survived in the historical record at all, when so much else from these men's lives has been lost completely. Court records and the handful of contemporary accounts that mention these articles weren't being written to flatter pirates, quite the opposite. They were written by frightened merchants, prosecuting governments, and at least one author cashing in on the public's appetite for lurid pirate stories. That one author deserves a name because almost everything we've discussed tonight ultimately traces back to him. Most of what survives about these articles, these votes, and these punishments comes down to us through a single remarkable book published in 1724, called A General History of the Robberies and Murders of the Most Notorious Pirates, written under the name Captain Charles Johnson. Nobody is entirely certain who Johnson actually was. Some historians have speculated he may have been a pen name for someone else entirely, possibly even Daniel Defoe himself, though that particular theory remains genuinely disputed. What's certain is that the book was an immediate sensation, drawing on court records, captured documents, and interviews with survivors and witnesses, and it remains, to this day, the single richest surviving window into exactly how these crews actually organised themselves. Almost every popular pirate story you've ever encountered, however fictionalized, traces back, at some distance, to this one dense, occasionally unreliable, endlessly fascinating book. And yet, even through that hostile lens, small human details like the musician's Sabbath kept getting noted down, almost as if the people recording them couldn't quite resist how strange and oddly touching it was. Cruelty made for predictable headlines. A fiddler's day off didn't fit the story anyone expected to tell, which is probably exactly why it stuck. And maybe that's worth holding on to, the next time you come across a piece of history that paints a group of people as purely, simply monstrous, with no complexity left in the picture at all. Real cruelty rarely arrives without some accompanying thread of ordinary human behaviour tangled in beside it, a kindness, a routine, a small rule protecting someone for no strategic reason at all. It doesn't excuse the cruelty. It never has, and it shouldn't. But it does mean the full picture is almost always more complicated than the version that survives in popular memory, which tends to keep only whichever half of the story is more convenient to tell. Why does any of this matter 3 centuries later to someone lying in the dark listening to a stranger's voice describe it? Maybe because it's a quiet reminder that the line between good people and bad people was never as clean as it's comforting to imagine. Maybe because most of us, if we're honest, have been unkind in some moments and unexpectedly generous in others, sometimes within the same single day. These men weren't unusual in that contradiction. They were just unusually visible, their worst and best moments both written down, by accident, in documents nobody expected anyone to still be reading 300 years later. None of this is meant to suggest these were secretly gentle men forced into violence against their will. Many of them chose this life freely, and many committed real, lasting harm to the people whose ships they captured. But history rarely offers the comfort of a single, uncomplicated story, and the men who lived through this one certainly didn't experience their own lives as a simple morality tale. They were, by every surviving account, capable of cruelty and capable of strange tenderness, sometimes within the same hour, the same battle, the same ordinary Tuesday at sea. That tension is uncomfortable to sit with. It's also, almost certainly, the truth. Maybe that's worth remembering about anyone in your own life too, including, every so often, yourself. People rarely fit neatly into the box of villain or hero for very long. Most of us are simply doing our best inside whatever circumstances we've been handed, some days more successfully than others. But here's the thing. As remarkable as all of this was, none of it lasted. The floating republics, the elected captains, the insurance funds and the protected Sundays, all of it burned out far faster than it took to build. And the story of exactly how it ended, and why, is where we're headed next. Because it brings us right back to the moment this entire story began. Chapter 8. The Tide Goes Out. We started tonight with Bartholomew Roberts, hit twice, dying on the deck of his own ship, his crew honouring his final request by sending his body into the sea rather than letting the Royal Navy claim it as a trophy. It's time to go back to that moment, because his death wasn't just the end of one man's story. It was, in a very real sense, the beginning of the end for the entire world we've spent tonight exploring. There's a small detail about Roberts himself worth sharing before we leave him for good, because it tells you something about how easily a man can be flattened into legend. By multiple surviving accounts, Roberts barely drank at all, preferring tea to the rum his own crew consumed without limit. And he was known for keeping a notably more disciplined, sober command than most of his contemporaries. The most successful pirate captain of the entire Golden Age, responsible by some counts for capturing more than 400 vessels in just 3 years, wasn't the wild, swaggering, caricature popular imagination tends to default to. He was, by most descriptions, careful, controlled, and almost startlingly competent, which might be exactly why he succeeded for as long as he did, in a trade where most men barely lasted a year or two before capture or death caught up with them. The Golden Age of Piracy didn't fade away slowly, the way some historical eras do. It collapsed, hard and fast, within roughly a single decade, under pressure from several directions at once. In 1718, a man named Woodes Rogers arrived in Nassau as the newly appointed governor of the Bahamas, carrying with him something the pirates hadn't faced before in any organised way: a genuine offer of the king's pardon for any pirate willing to walk away from the life, combined with the very real threat of aggressive naval enforcement for anyone who refused. Some took the deal. Benjamin Hornigold, one of the more established captains operating out of Nassau, accepted the pardon and turned almost overnight into a pirate hunter himself, using his old knowledge of the trade against his former colleagues. Others refused outright, and paid for that refusal within months or years. Picture the actual scene in Nassau Harbour when Rogers arrived, because it's a striking image in its own right. He sailed in with a small fleet and the formal pardon document in hand, anchoring in a harbour that had, for nearly 2 years, operated as a genuine pirate stronghold, a town with no real governor, run loosely by a council of captains, exactly the kind of place we described back in Chapter 1. Hundreds of pirates were present when he arrived, vastly outnumbering his own forces. By most accounts, the moment could easily have gone the other way entirely, with the pirates simply overwhelming Roger's small fleet and continuing on as though nothing had happened. Instead, enough of them chose to take the pardon, worn down by disease, by infighting, and by simple exhaustion, with a life that, for all its rules and rough fairness, still carried enormous daily risk of death. The Pirate Republic didn't fall to superior firepower so much as it slowly lost the will of enough of its own population to keep defending it. Within a couple of years, Nassau was a fully garrisoned, conventionally governed British colonial outpost again, as though the floating republic had never existed there at all. Blackbeard was killed in a brutal close-quarters battle off the coast of North Carolina that same year, 1718, fighting a Royal Navy lieutenant who'd been sent specifically to end him. Calico Jack Rackham, along with Anne Bonny and Mary Read, was captured in 1720 and tried not long after, the story we spent an entire chapter unpacking earlier tonight. Charles Vane, the captain deposed by his own crew for refusing to fight, was eventually captured and executed in 1721. And Bartholomew Roberts himself, the most successful of them all by almost any measure, was killed in 1722, the exact moment we opened tonight's story with. What happened after Roberts's death deserves its own mention, because of just how decisively it marked the end of an era. The surviving members of his crew were captured and brought to Cape Coast Castle on the West African coast for what became the largest pirate trial of the entire period. Well over 100 men tried, with dozens ultimately executed. It was a deliberate, public, overwhelming display of force, designed specifically to make an example so large that it would be impossible for any other crew, anywhere, to convince themselves that piracy still had a future worth risking everything for. But here's the thing. Naval force alone doesn't fully explain why piracy collapsed as quickly as it did. Because navies had been chasing pirates, with limited success, for years before this. The deeper reason runs back to exactly where we started tonight's story, the supply of desperate, unemployed sailors that had fed piracy in the first place. By the early 1720s, European economies had stabilized considerably since the end of the War of the Spanish Succession, nearly a decade earlier. Merchant trade had recovered. Naval recruitment, while still often brutal, had absorbed much of the excess labour that had once had nowhere else to go. The specific historical moment that had pushed thousands of trained, armed, furious sailors toward piracy in the first place was closing. And without a constant fresh supply of desperate men willing to risk everything, even the most well-organised floating republic eventually runs out of new recruits to replace the ones who'd been captured, killed, or simply grown old, waiting for one good final haul. By most modern estimates, several thousand men were actively engaged in piracy at the height of this period, a startlingly small number when measured against the enormous, decades-long fear they generated across the entire Atlantic shipping world. It tells you something about how disproportionately disruptive a relatively small number of well-organised, well-armed, genuinely fearless men could be, when every merchant ship they targeted had no equivalent structure of its own to fall back on. So what's actually left of all this, 300 years later, once you strip away the parrots and the eye patches and the buried treasure maps that were mostly invented by novelists, generations after the fact? What's left is the articles themselves, the written agreements, the elected leadership, the insurance payouts, the protected rest days, preserved in court records and a handful of surviving documents, studied today not as pirate trivia, but as a genuinely startling case study in how ordinary, desperate people organise themselves when every external authority disappears. It's worth marvelling, for a moment, at how quickly the legend outran the actual history. Within just a few decades of the last major captains being captured or killed, popular plays, ballads, and embellished retellings had already begun reshaping these men into something closer to folklore than fact. Dashing, flamboyant, driven by greed and bravado rather than by desperation, and a fierce practical hunger for fairness. By the time treasure maps, parrots, and peg legs became fixed parts of the pirate image, centuries later, almost none of it had anything to do with documented history at all. The real story, articles signed by candlelight, votes cast by raised hands, a disability fund locked in a chest below deck, was simply less commercially exciting than the version that eventually won out in the popular imagination. Historians who specialise in this period have pointed out, again and again, just how far ahead of their time some of these structures actually were. Elected leadership with built-in accountability, a pooled mandatory fund to cover catastrophic injury, profit sharing tied to collective success rather than individual hoarding, protected rest time, even for the lowest status worker aboard. None of it came from philosophy. None of it came from reading Enlightenment political theorists, most of whom these men had never heard of and couldn't have read even if they had. It came entirely from necessity, from 200 armed, traumatized, frequently uneducated men figuring out, through trial and consequence, exactly what kept a desperate group of people from destroying itself from the inside. Historians like Marcus Rediker, who has spent much of his career studying exactly this period, have argued that pirate crews represented something close to an early experiment in multiracial, worker-organised resistance against the brutal maritime labour practices of the era, a genuinely radical alternative, built not from political theory, but from lived necessity. By men with nothing left to lose, and, for a brief window, surprisingly little left to fear from the structures that had failed them. And maybe that's the real reason this story keeps getting told, generation after generation, long after the actual gold and the actual ships have turned to dust at the bottom of the ocean. Not because of the violence, though there was plenty of it, not because of the freedom, though there was real freedom in it too, but because of what it reveals about people in general, stripped of every external rule, every safety net, every reason to expect fairness from anyone. Given absolutely nothing, and absolutely no reason to trust each other, these men built courts, insurance, elections, and rest days anyway, not because some authority told them to. Because, left with nothing else, that's apparently what people do. It would be too tidy to say these pirate crews single-handedly reformed maritime labour conditions going forward. And that's not quite what happened. But the threat they represented wasn't lost on the navies and ship owners who'd helped create the conditions that pushed so many men toward piracy in the first place. A workforce that could simply vanish overnight, taking its labour, its skills, and sometimes its weapons to the most dangerous alternative imaginable, was a genuine practical problem, not just a moral one. Conditions aboard legitimate ships did slowly, unevenly improve over the following century. Better food, somewhat more humane discipline, eventually the gradual decline of impressment itself. None of it came quickly, and none of it came close to matching what these outlaw crews had already built for themselves decades earlier. But the pressure these men applied, simply by existing and by demonstrating there was somewhere else entirely fed-up sailors could go, left a mark on the system they'd escaped, even if that system never once acknowledged it. So, was Bartholomew Roberts a monster, or a man doing exactly what his era and his circumstances had made nearly unavoidable? Was the entire pirate world a tragedy of desperate men with no other options, or a strange accidental triumph of fairness built from the bottom up, by people history had already written off completely? Maybe, 300 years on, it's still both at once. And maybe that's exactly why it's worth remembering, on a quiet night like this one, as the story finally comes in to rest. Settling in for the night, let the ship settle now. Let your own thoughts settle along with it. Bartholomew Roberts never saw the trial that followed his death. He never stood in chains at Cape Coast Castle, never heard the sentences read out one by one to the men who'd served under him. His crew kept the promise they'd made him weeks earlier, in calmer waters, and let the ocean take him instead, weapons and all, exactly the way he'd asked. No grave anyone could visit, no body for any government to parade as a trophy. Just water, closing quietly over a man who had, for 3 remarkable years, run one of the strangest, strictly fairest little nations the Atlantic had ever seen. Entirely without anyone back in London or Lisbon or Madrid ever agreeing to recognise it as one. What he left behind wasn't gold. In the end, not really. Gold gets spent, or seized, or lost to time, the way almost all of it eventually was. What he left behind, what all of these crews left behind, across the whole strange brief decade we've spent tonight exploring, was a kind of proof. Proof that fairness isn't something only stable, comfortable societies can afford to build. Proof that even people the rest of the world has already condemned as irredeemable can still choose, given the smallest space to do it in, to treat each other with more consideration than the systems that cast them out ever showed them. It's tempting, lying here at the end of a story like this one, to want a clean verdict, to decide once and for all whether these were heroes worth admiring or villains worth condemning, and to let that decision settle the matter completely. But 3 centuries of distance haven't actually simplified these men. If anything, the closer you look, the more contradictions surface. A captain who barely drank, surrounded by men who drank without limit. A crew capable of real cruelty who nonetheless protected their fiddler's day off. A system built entirely outside the law that ended up fairer, in several specific ways, than the law it was built outside of. Maybe the honest takeaway isn't a verdict at all. Maybe it's simply the observation that desperate circumstances reveal what people actually do when nobody is watching and nothing is guaranteed. And that what these particular people did, again and again, was build something more careful and more equitable than anyone expected outlaws to bother building. Maybe that's worth carrying with you, long after tonight, long after you've forgotten the exact number of pieces of 8 owed for a missing arm, or the precise hour the candles had to go out. Somewhere underneath all of it is a simple, almost comforting idea. Structure and fairness aren't gifts that only get handed down from above, by kings or governments or anyone else with the power to grant them. Sometimes they get built from the bottom, by the people with the least power of all, simply because they decided, together, that it mattered enough to insist on. There's something quietly reassuring in that, if you let yourself sit with it for just a moment longer. Whatever uncertainty tomorrow might hold for you, whatever rules govern the spaces you move through, a workplace, a family, a friendship, most of them, somewhere underneath the paperwork, were built by people who once had to decide, the same way these pirates did, what fairness was actually going to mean in practice. You're surrounded, more than you probably notice most days, by small structures other people built so that you wouldn't have to face certain fears entirely alone. That's worth a quiet kind of gratitude, even on an ordinary night. Picture, just once more, the simplest version of where we've been tonight. Wooden ships, salt air, men with nothing left to lose, sitting down together to write rules nobody made them write, voting for leaders nobody made them elect, setting aside money for injuries nobody could guarantee wouldn't happen. None of it erased the violence at the centre of their lives. None of it made what they did to the people they robbed, or worse, any less real or any less wrong. But somewhere inside all that contradiction, they kept choosing, again and again, to treat each other with more fairness than the world had ever shown them. That's not a tidy moral. It's not meant to be. It's simply what was actually there, recorded in their own handwriting, 300 years before any of us were born to wonder about it. Somewhere out past the edge of whatever room you're in right now, picture that same ocean, dark and enormous and entirely indifferent to any of this, the same water that once closed over Bartholomew Roberts. The same water Alexander Selkirk stared at for 4 lonely years. The same water that carried thousands of desperate, hopeful, frightened men toward lives none of them could have predicted when they first signed their names or made their mark on a piece of paper nobody back home would ever take seriously. It's still out there tonight, moving the same slow way it always has, asking nothing of you at all. And on that thought, it's time to let this one go. The ship has made it safely to harbour tonight, in a manner of speaking. The candles are out, the deck is quiet, Whatever waited beyond the horizon can wait a little longer. As your eyes grow heavy tonight, let the rest of this story settle into the back of your mind, the way a long voyage settles into memory once the ship is finally still. There's nothing left to do now but rest. So as you drift off, picture that quiet, slow-moving ocean and the rough, complicated, surprisingly fair little world that once floated on top of it. Good night and sleep well. Until next time, when we'll cast off again and find another forgotten corner of pirate history, waiting in the dark